Hey, this is Blighted Pine Books, and today we're going to take a look at the novel The Broom of the System by David Foster Wallace. A little bit of background on the novel. This book was first published in 1987. It was David Foster Wallace's first novel that he wrote when he was 24 years old at Amherst University, and it was submitted as one of two undergraduate theses. It's a novel that's informed by the novelist Thomas Pynchon and David Foster Wallace's favorite philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein. It's a novel that is somewhat autobiographical. David Foster Wallace wrote of the book that it's the sensitive tale of a sensitive young wasp who's just had this midlife crisis that's moved from coldly cerebral analytic math to coldly cerebral take on fiction, which also shifted his existential dread from a fear that he was just a 98.6 degree calculating machine to a fear that he was nothing but a linguistic construct. Before I go into the book review itself, I just want to talk a little bit about my experience with previous David Foster Wallace works. The first book that I read of his is his most famous work, Infinite Jest. And this was a novel that I picked up in Boulder, Colorado, whenever I was living out there for about a year. I remember buying it with some hesitation because it's probably like the longest and hardest book I'd ever attempted to read. I wasn't maybe that great of a reader. I was an English teacher at the time. I was working at a juvenile detention center, not teaching the highest level literature. And I found the language pretty difficult to work through. The plot was all over the place. It's not written in chronological order. So I struggled. However, I really liked Foster Wallace naturally because he was like the first novelist that I read that I felt was like speaking to someone, I don't know, maybe my age or speaking to me at my level and using an idiom that was kind of common parlance. Also, I thought Infinite Jest was just funny. It was really melancholic and it was insightful, and it had all these weird puzzles in it too. And so, like I said, I was working at a juvenile detention center in Brighton, Colorado at the time, and this book kind of like carried me through that experience, and it pretty much took me that entire year to read the book as I was like dealing with a whole lot of stuff. And there were some other things, just weird things that came up while I was reading Infinite Jest. I went to this one microbrewery in Lafayette, which is the town I was living in, and there's a bartender there. And when he saw me reading Infinite Jest, which is not a book that's difficult to spot from far away, he said that it was his favorite book, that he'd read it a number of times, and that he even had one of the notorious footnotes tattooed on his foot. And at the same time, while I was living in Colorado, my one roommate, who was he was the son of like probably one of the wealthiest families I've ever met. They had this gorgeous, probably like 50-acre plot of land at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and they raised animals and like bears and lions for Hollywood films. But this guy, for whatever reason, was living with me, and he was a severe alcoholic, and that became pretty clear. He wasn't working very much. I remember one winter looking at his car and seeing just snow piling up week after week as he hadn't left the house. And one day I came home, and after a really hard day at the detention center, I found him on the floor of the landing, passed out, and I ended up taking him or going with him to AA, and kind of really experiencing firsthand like the perils of addiction. And it's just interesting, the Infinite Jest, the two themes that it primarily deals with are entertainment and addiction, whether that be to substances or to entertainment itself. But just in general, I really liked Infinite Jest. I know it's kind of like a bro book, but I just liked it. I thought it was funny and really insightful and super well written, and I liked a lot of the characters, and I came out the other end just ready to kind of tackle some other like longer hard novels that I would read in in the near future. Ended up reading Brothers Karamazov and The Sound and the Fury and Gravity's Rainbow and a number of others. Also, I read a couple other David Foster Wallace works, like his book of essays titled Consider the Lobster, which has a really awesome essay about the Maine Lobster Festival and just about lobster eating in general, the ethics of how to properly kill lobsters, and he writes about it in such a funny way. And then also Oblivion, which is a book of short stories that contains like good old neon. I remember one of the stories in there is like one of my favorite short stories of all time. Anyhow, I really like David Foster Wallace, and I'd been wanting to read some of his other stuff, and this is his first book, and so I was just kind of curious, like what a really young David Foster Wallace wrote like, and so yeah, let's find out. So this book, The Broom of the System, it might be worth talking about the title for a minute. So The Broom of the System was like essentially, it was based on a conversation that the protagonist Lenore had with her grandmother, where her grandmother asked her like what the most important part of the broom is. Is it the sweeping part of the broom or the handle part of the broom? And she said, well, of course it's the sweeping part. And her grandmother said, well, what if you're trying to break out of a window? And so it kind of opens up this question about the relationship between our experience and the language we use to describe that experience. So anyhow, this is a book about a girl named Lenore Beedsman. She's the protagonist. And it's about her boyfriend, whose name is Rick Vigorous. And he owns a publishing company titled Frequent and Vigorous. There's this other guy, Andrew, I think you pronounce his nickname Wang Dang. So it's like Andrew Wang Dang Lang. Actually, he has a middle name, Andrew Wang Dang Sealander Lang. And he is married to Mindy Metalman. There's also Vlad the Impaler, a hyper-verbal cockatiel who may or may not have done LSD, and also this guy Norman Bombardini, who's the owner of the Bombardini building and Bombardini company, and who is solving the problem of self versus other by eating everything. So this book has a plot, kind of, and it's what I would probably call a MacGuffin plot. If you don't know, a MacGuffin is a plot that essentially serves to push forward the narrative, but is otherwise completely insignificant. In this book, it's about Lenore and her grandmother, who has recently escaped from a nursing home with a cohort of others, though she's like the ringleader of this escape. And apparently they have escaped to a place called the Great Ohio Desert. Oh yeah, this book, it takes place entirely in Ohio. This is like the map of the town. And the town is in the shape of actress from the 50s. I can't remember her name. There's too much going on in this book, but anyhow, you can kind of see that. Anyhow, within this community is there's a desert that's been created by the mayor, and it's called the Great Ohio Desert, or in other words, God. And Lenore's grandmother has supposedly escaped to the desert, and so we need to go find her. The primary plot, though, is really about Lenore and her relationship with Rick Vigorous. Their relationship is kind of failing, and they're both attending therapy. They both go to the same therapist, this guy named Dr. J, where they mostly partake in like Wittgensteinian language games, but also it kind of helps to deconstruct the relationship to the point of implosion. Rick Vigorous, also, works for this publishing company, Frequent and Vigorous, and so he receives all these stories, and he is apparently not vigorous enough for Lenore, and so in order to compensate for his lack of vigor, he reads her stories. Some of the stories are really good. My favorite one is about this guy who falls in love with every woman that he meets. Like head over heels, he starts lunging at them, and they often will like beat him with their purses or start screaming or, run away or whatever. And so there's this kind of irony that like he has all of this love to give, and the only thing that he receives is like, yelps of terror. And so he ends up going to this love therapist, and this love therapist tells him that what he needs to do is find someone that he has no attraction to whatsoever. And he finds this woman. Her name is Thermos Woman because she has a thermos, and she wears a scarf around her neck, and they get very close with one another. And after many months together, this character asks the thermos woman to remove her scarf, and he removes it for her, and underneath her scarf is a very cute amphibian. Yeah, the story goes on. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who reads it, but it's just such a bizarre and funny, and at the end it's like compelling and heartwarming. So he tells a lot of stories kind of like that. They're all really about, I think they're about David Foster Wallace himself. Also, structure of the book, it is, thank goodness, it's chronological. It's a little bit, I'd say it's easier to read than Infinite Jest. It's made up of these bits of conversation between Lenore and Rick, and Lenore and Candy Mandible, who is her co-worker. There is Rick and Andrew that are having conversations. There are therapist transcripts, and those are some of the best reads in the book between Dr. J and Lenore and Dr. J and Rick. There are stories that are narrated by Rick. There are stories that are actually... There's one story that's written by Rick that's very disturbing, but I'll just let you read it. There's some traditional prose, just like descriptive language, and then there's television transcripts because Vlad has become a feature on a local Christian television show. And so, yeah, there's that too. Okay, some of the big ideas in this book. Wittgenstein's language games. So I didn't know anything about Wittgenstein. I ended up listening to the beginning of his second book. I think it's called Philosophical Principles. Don't quote me. And I listened to some of that, and I realized that I probably just need to read it because it's really complicated. But I did pick up on some of the basic ideas that Wittgenstein was trying to get across, which essentially is the question of to what degree is language the construct of our being. And Lenore's grandmother was a student of Wittgenstein and I think Derrida, and so she tried to pass on some of these postmodern concepts to Lenore, and so Lenore throughout her entire life struggles with these concepts. Okay, so let me read you a little bit. This is on page 119. If you want to read along. So this is a conversation between Lenore and her therapist, Dr. J. Lenore says, "Suppose Grandma tells me really convincingly that all that really exists of my life is what can be said about it." "What the hell does that mean?" says Jay. "You feel anger. I have an ejection button, you know. I can press a button on the underside of this drawer here and send you screaming into the lake." Lenore says, "You must be about the worst psychologist of all time. Why won't you let me go with my thoughts?" "I'm sorry," says Jay. "That's why I'm here, right? That's why I pay you roughly 2/3 of everything I make, right? I'm honored and ashamed all at once. Back to the grandmother and a life that's told, not lived." Right. So what would that mean? In all earnestness, I say, you tell me. "Well, see, it seems like it's not really like a life that's told, not lived. It's just the living is the telling, and there's nothing going on with me that is neither told or tellable. And if so, what's the difference? Why live at all? I really don't understand. Maybe it just makes no sense. Maybe it's just completely irrational and dumb. But obviously it bothers you." "Pretty keen perception," says Lenore. "If there's nothing about me but what can be said about me, what separates me from this lady in the story Rick got, who eats junk food and gains weight and squashes her child in her sleep?" That's another story. "She's exactly what said about her, right? Nothing more at all. And the same with me, seems like. Grandma says she's going to show me how life is words and nothing else. Grandma says words can kill and create everything." So that's like the big idea in The Broom of the System, is the relationship between human beings and language. And I still think about this today a lot. Sometimes I share it with my students, actually. This idea that, like, you know, are we more than language? And like, I start thinking, like, are we like the spaces in between? What is like, because life is so much of what we have to say about it, and what we say and think about other people, and what we read about the world that's going on, and what other people have to say about the world. And so it does seem like so much of what we do is within the linguistic realm. And so it's like, okay, to what degree is life not that? And if it's not linguistic, what is it? So yeah, it's a big question. And I guess Wittgenstein is really important for having thought about that, and I can see why. Also, there's this idea of like self and other that I feel like is kind of underdeveloped, and it comes together with the language thing a little bit later with like Rick Vigorous, who's literally not able to like become one with Lenore, and then Norman Barbadini's formerly alluded to solution to self and other, which is for the self to literally become the other by eating everything. Okay. A couple other things, I guess. Writing style is very cool. I think it's probably the most interesting thing about Foster Wallace in general. But this is like David Foster Wallace in his nascence as a writer. He's talked about in some interviews like this brain voice thing that he does, and I really like that. It's like his books read pretty fast because he writes in brain voice, not in like spoken reading voice, and that's kind of like why he says he struggles when he has to do public readings, because it's just not the voice of the book itself. The book is written in the brain and should be read in the brain. Also, there's a lot of the and, but, so multi-conjunction things that he used so much in Infinite Jest. There's a couple of those. I'd say it's playful, it's fun. I think that's like his signature characteristic. You can even tell that in the conversation itself. The whole thing is like kind of jokey, but at the same time being unbelievably melancholy and depressing. All of the David Foster Wallace fundamentals are here. The obsession with these little witty ironies, his strange situation, like Lenore's brother, whose nickname is the Anarchist, and he's missing a leg, and you get told the story of his missing leg and how his mother was climbing a trellis because she wasn't allowed to see her children, so she was coming in to kind of like spy on her kids, and she falls down while she was pregnant with the Antichrist, and his leg gets like shot off of his body upon landing. Strange situations like that. There's all these bizarre character names. I read Gravity's Rainbow last year. I didn't do a review on it. I don't think I was doing book reviews then. But there's a lot of like very bizarre character names that have meaning, you know. There's I call it like the absurd MacGuffin plot line, and then a text that's like steeped in like academia, postmodern thoughts and philosophy. There's like the collegiate setting, which is also done in Infinite Jest, and then the paragraph spanning sentences. They're not as long as they are as Infinite Jest, but they're here. So in general, what's my review? I said all the pieces are present. All of this, like the funny stuff, the philosophical stuff, the plot MacGuffin that kind of keeps you rolling along a little bit. It's all there, but I feel like for whatever reason, it just doesn't like come together. But at the same time, Foster Wallace was 24 years old when he wrote this, so I'm willing to it's like pretty forgivable for a 24-year-old. Also, characters are very flat. There's not a lot of development with the characters. You do really get to know them more, especially Lenore Beadsman, who I really think is David Foster Wallace. I think this is a coming-of-age novel, and that Lenore is Foster Wallace. But she doesn't really develop in the text that much. The story just kind of implodes on her. And finally, I think for like a big fan of David Foster Wallace, this is a very interesting book. If you like his other stuff, I think it's worth reading. I guess I'm a fanboy now. I've read a lot of his stuff, and right now I'm reading another one. If you love Foster Wallace, got to read it. So at the end of the day, if I had to like give it a number or something, I guess I'd give it like a 6 out of 10, just in terms of like other books. But I still really liked it. So it's weird. That's my book. That's my book review of The Broom, the System by David Foster Wallace. I hope you enjoyed listening, or maybe it inspired you to read it, or maybe if you see it, you'll throw it out a window or something. Thank you. This is Blighted Pine Books. I haven't said this before, but if you want to like or subscribe, I want to get more subscribers. That's part of why I do this, is to feed the ego and stuff. So if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing and all that stuff, that would be cool. Y'all have a good one.